The 2020 World Day Against Child Labor was marked on Friday, June 12. This year's celebration focuses on the impact of crisis on child labor, the COVID-19 health pandemic, and the resulting economic and labor market shock are having a huge impact on people's lives and livelihoods. Unfortunately, children are often the first to suffer. Now, the International Labour Organization and UNICEF say the crisis can push millions of vulnerable children into child labor. Target 8.7 of the UN Sustainable Development Goals calls for an end to child labor in all its forms by 2025. While the number of children in child labor has declined by 94 million since 2000, the rate of reduction slowed by 2/3 in recent years, particularly in Africa. So, how can the world community, particularly Africa and indeed Nigeria, get firmly on track towards eliminating child labor? I'm being joined by the Director, ILO Country Office for Nigeria, Ghana, Liberia, and Sierra Leone, Mr. Dennis Zulu. Thank you very much, Mr. Zulu, for joining us on the show.
My pleasure. Good morning.
So what do you describe as a child labor?
Well, a child laborer is a young child who below the age, the legally permissible age, indulges in what we call hazardous work. And in Nigeria, a list of hazardous jobs has been worked on by the tripartite partners. And some of the jobs that are classified as hazardous work include hawking, include child sex work, include some aspects of farming, which ultimately deprive the children of the opportunities to go to school. So what we're saying is really that you can actually indulge in some work between the ages of 16 to 18 in supervised environment, but if you work below the age of 16, then you're involved in what is called child labor, and these are in the occupations that I've just mentioned.
Now, there are situations in a family, struggling to make ends meet. It's not like the child is not going to school. The child, yes, goes to school, but when he or she comes back, he's expected to help his parents or works, to help the house economy, either in form of going to farm work or hawking. Things, just to put food on the table. Under such circumstances, would that also be termed as child labor?
Well, there's a distinction between, as I say, between child labor, but what you're referring to is what is called child socialization. And as you know, each child during the process of growing is allowed to learn the different tasks that you have to perform as a human being. And therefore, any work that is done in the process of socializing the child, making the child aware of their responsibilities as growing up, is really called child work. And that in itself is permissible. What is not permissible is for these jobs to become the main preoccupation of the child. So the child stops going to school and is therefore engaged in hawking, for instance, the whole day, is engaged in child sex work. Those sorts of vocations are not permissible. So indeed, we recognize the fact that the child, when growing up, has to do certain things, help with the father in the garden, help the mother in cooking or washing the dishes. That is permissible, and so long as the child goes to school. But that should not become the number one preoccupation, where you're depriving the child of the opportunity to enjoy the benefits of growing up and being able to learn what a responsible adult will need to be.
Okay, now, child labor decreased globally by nearly 94 million since year 2000. However, that does not apply to Africa. Progress in the fight against child labor seems to have slowed down. Some studies indicate that 32% of workers in Africa are victims of child labor. In Asia, it's 17%, and the advanced economies, it's 1%. Why so?
Well, I think one thing we should recognize is the fact that in Africa, the level of poverty, which is one of the principal drivers of child labor, have been increasing steadily over the years. I mean, when you look at the recent report from the National Bureau of Statistics in Nigeria, which indicates about 41% of Nigerians live in poverty, that in itself is an indicator that things are not looking good on the poverty front. So when you see an increase in poverty, you will definitely see an increase in child labor, because child labor is also seen as one of the coping strategies for families who then have to resort to using children to supplement the income that they get. Economically as well, Africa has not been doing very well of the last decade or so, although there's been one or two countries doing with extremely very good economic growth rates. But the levels of inequalities have grown as well. So there's an increase in the number of poverty, people falling in the poverty trap, but also that, in a way, also contributes to the increase in the number of children who are working. The opportunities really in the job market are not there. So you'll find that because parents can't work, then they're forced to use children to be able to complement whatever little incomes they have. And this has been particularly seen during this period of COVID, where because of containment measures, business have had to close, workers and families leading or really depending on selling in the market, for instance, have had very little incomes coming in. Hence, the pressure on families to sustain their livelihoods has increased, hence the increase of child labor.
Now, you had warned that child labor is likely to increase, particularly at this time of crisis. We're dealing with COVID-19 pandemic. Can you talk us through some of the main channels through which the COVID-19 pandemic is likely to affect progress towards the eradication of child labor?
Okay, it's very clear, obviously, that there's been a marked decline, and we're expecting a recession for not or in a recession already in Nigeria. What does that mean? There's a reduction in productivity, there's a reduction in economic activities, and in primarily there'll be an increase in the levels of unemployed in the country. But more importantly, Nigeria has a lot of people working what we call the informal economy, which contributes significant numbers to the number of employed in this country. Uh, as part of the containment measures, I said businesses were closed for some time, are still closed in certain parts of Nigeria, and therefore parents who depended on jobs in these organizations, who depended on jobs in the informal economy, selling in the market, getting themselves involved in all sorts of income generating activities, have seen a loss in incomes. So what does that mean? That basically means that parents now have to look at alternatives, and seriously, in situations where poverty is most pronounced, children are being asked to take upon the responsibility of getting more incomes for their family. Now, related to the loss of jobs and the loss of incomes leading to child labor, we've also seen that schools have been shut. It therefore means that children are in households idling about, and therefore are seen to keep themselves busy. Parents might be tempted to use them to make the children bring more incomes and send them off to hawk or send them to do all sorts of things that really they would not be doing. Um, Also, when we do actually, there's a study that shows that if even when schools reopen, due to the declining incomes and the fact that families have lost their sustainability, it might be very difficult for them to send their children back to school. Because, as you know, sending children to school requires certain things such as uniforms, such as books and lunch money. But because of jobs that have been lost, families will not be able to send their children back. So, as a result, we are bound to see a marked increase in the number of children working, because families really will have very few alternatives in as far as keeping their families sustainable.
So, from all you have said, what can African governments, particularly Nigeria, what they need to do now to protect children from child labor?
Well, I think some of the things that have been done already. I mean, Nigeria has done fairly well in terms of policy. We have the child labor policy, we have the hazardous list, and I think there's been some changes in legislation which really prohibit child labor. So one of the things the government can do is basically keep on ensuring that the inspections done by the Ministry of Employment and Labor and Employment to ensure that child labor is not practiced, continue sensitization of families not to ensure child labor, not to use child labor, but more prominently, looking at what the government is trying to do in order to stimulate the economy so that at least the economy can grow, jobs can be created, and if jobs are created, then you see less pressure on families needing to use children. So, in addition, I think some of the things that government has done, I think need to be done. There needs to be some more expansion, for instance, of the social assistance program that's been implemented, so as to assist families complement their income, their low incomes with some wage subsidy from the government, but also to see how some of these palliatives can reach families which are really in need of support. Because if they get the relief from government, then hopefully they do not have to send their children off to the streets. There's quite a lot that needs to be done. I hope that it will be difficult given the fact the economy has not been doing too well. Oil prices have gone down. So it needs the concerted effort of all of us to ensure that we work towards the reduction of child labor by providing for families that are particularly vulnerable, but also for ensuring that children who are not in school go to school.
Now, the ILO and UNICEF are developing a simulation model to look at the impact of COVID-19 on child labor globally. What should we expect from this new global estimate?
Well, definitely, even without wasting much time, it's obviously that there's been an increase in child labor across the world, and more specifically in Africa, where already prior to the COVID crisis, economies were not doing too well. Most of the economies were debt stressed, jobs were very low, and therefore there was still a trend towards an increase of child labor. So it is anticipated that the results from the simulation to determine the impact of child labor will show a marked increase in children working, especially in the hazardous forms across the continent, in Nigeria inclusive.
All right, thank you very much for your time, Mr. Zulu. Mr.
Thank you
Dennis
so much,
Zulu
ma'am.
is the Director, ILO Country Office for Nigeria, Ghana, Liberia, and Sierra Leone.